How can companies cope with rising labor costs? I'm joined today by Kent Mahoney. He's Executive Vice President of North America with Proxima. Hi, Kent.
Hi, Bob. Pleasure to be here.
Thanks for joining me. So this is a big issue for companies of all sorts these days. What is the trend right now that you see in general labor availability and wage rates?
Yeah, so I think we're seeing companies really approach this from a few different angles. In general, we're seeing a shortage of labor availability across different sectors, particularly when you start looking at the some of the lower paid professions that are out there. A lot of this, in our view, is being driven by the continued provision of federal assistance throughout the COVID and the extension of unemployment benefits that are in many cases just making it the logical conclusion to not return to work because families are financially better off in not choosing to do so. And so we're seeing this lead to a significant shortage in labor across sector.
Well, those are going to run out, and when they do, would you expect a flood of applicants in the job market?
I absolutely think that's correct. I think as well as people start to overcome some of their concerns about certain safety practices that may be available once they return to work as well, you'll see that contribute to the surge of interest in jobs again. But what's interesting to me is there are so many companies that have already quite correctly started to take measures to counteract even a temporary trend in labor shortage that may result in there not being quite so many jobs once people are looking to return to the workforce.
Oh, so their expectations are, well, we're ready to go back to work now, and they show up at these businesses, and the businesses are saying, "Sorry, guys, we have already made other arrangements." Right? So preparing for a lack of workers, and what kind of arrangements might those be? Might they be automation? Might they be reorganization of roles within the organization so that you need fewer people to get the same work done? What might we be looking at there?
It's quite interesting. You see all different ranges of tactics for dealing with this issue. And it all falls into what sort of a company it is and how they deal with their customer base. You have certain industries and companies that are frankly have what I would call customer service inelastic demand for their goods and services. So we're all familiar with price inelasticity, but there are certain companies where the level of customer service they provide is not directly tied to the demand for their goods and services. A great example of that would be some of the big box retail stores. And you've probably experienced this as I have. You go in and you're looking to buy low cost goods, and you might only see 2 out of 15 different cash registers being staffed right now, and trying to funnel folks to self service instead. But it's not going to keep me from going there again next week to buy groceries because I got a family of 6 and it's the cheapest place to acquire that.
Yeah.
Right? So I'm not turned off by a long wait in line. There are other organizations that are seeing that even a temporary decline in customer service is going to have a significant impact on demand and thus their ability to capture that revenue. And so they have already made moves to increase the minimum wage. Some examples of that would be Starbucks. Under Armour is another great example of that, where they've increased their base wage for their lowest paid employees because they have to keep up with a certain level of service to continue to justify, in some cases, a premium on their pricing for their goods and services.
You're talking here a lot about a lot of customer facing positions, but what about behind the scenes of the supply chain? What about warehouse, fulfillment, transportation, and for that matter, the manufacturing line? What are the challenges there?
So that's a fundamentally different trend. And that brings me to the third type of company, right? Which is those that are already proactively moving to counter even a temporary labor shortage. And what we're seeing in that market is definitely a trend towards further automation. And that's both on a physical labor automation as well as an office worker automation perspective at this stage. So everyone is continually trying to push the boundaries of what sort of activities and processes can be addressed through robotics process automation and digital opportunities, as well as physical automation opportunities in warehousing and distribution. There was something like a 20% increase in Q1 of this year, year over year, in sales of industrial robots. And that's an increase that we've not seen in a couple of years. And that's really being used to try to counter some of these effects.
Increase in robotics and automation notwithstanding, we still need bodies in plants to a certain extent. And I'm wondering whether all this talk about the vulnerability of domestic supply chains has manufacturers thinking, at least, and maybe in some cases acting, about reshoring, coming back to the United States and building plants or reopening plants here. Are they going to have, will those efforts be hampered or hindered by the lack of availability of workforce to any degree?
It's interesting. It's one of those things where it's a short-term hindrance, but long-term, it's kind of forcing companies to start thinking about that.
Mhm.
We are seeing some manufacturers turn to this as an opportunity to be able to say it's made in America again, right? And almost similar to what we've seen long-term trends in the BPO market, where companies used to offshore as much of their back office processes as possible to places like Bangalore and Manila. They've really used software automation opportunities to bring that workforce back in-house and get the same productivity and cost efficiencies, but just with a smaller internal team, basically. We're seeing the same sort of thing happen with warehousing and distribution. I think we're going to start seeing the start of a trend where it's moving that labor workforce back onshore into America, but it's going to be a smaller size team than what we've seen in times past.
Mhm. And you do seem to be somewhat optimistic that, as we say, as the government payments go away, the people will be will be looking for jobs. And so to the extent they're needed at all in warehouses and in factories and the like, the supply you think will be there.
Yes,
Yeah.
absolutely. And I think, as with any emerging technology, we're still at that wild optimism phase around a lot of this, and you'll
Mm,
probably see a slower ramp up to automation than perhaps many will predict. So we
yeah.
will need those people when they return to the work.
Now, labor is not the only cost going up right now. We have rising costs of raw materials, packaging, and shipping. What can executives do in order to mitigate the potential disruptions and the increased costs from those aspects of the supply chain?
You really have to get your supply chain management and procurement practices into sharp focus. I think what we've seen is that companies have been focused quite a bit on optimizing some of their direct expenditures, but not necessarily the entirety of the supply chain. They haven't been very much focused on finding redundant supply chains where they need it. And because of this, they haven't built out or developed their procurement practices as much as they ought to in some cases. And so what we're seeing now is that's all well and good in a deflationary environment where it's easy to get cost reduction measures in place. But now that we're very much in an inflationary market, it's going to become much more critical that companies draft to find those sorts of capabilities and skill sets, bring them on board in the form of employees, in the form of better practices and processes and governance models so they can manage those costs.
Mhm.
Uh, I don't know that it will ever be easy over the next year or so to drive hard dollar cost reduction, but you've got to get the measures in place to at least mitigate the impact of inflationary pressures as much as possible.
Well, there we are back again to some aspect of labor as well. So I want to bring you back around to that discussion again and ask you, in addition, as you said, well, certainly companies are offering more money in certain sectors to attract employees back to the workplace. But beyond that, what advice do you have, or what should companies be doing to attract and retain talent beyond just jacking up wages?
Yeah, I think there's a little bit of a trust factor that goes into this, right? And there are some companies where, when the pandemic hit, the first move they made was to cut headcount as fast as humanly possible. And I understand that, because in many ways it's the easiest, fastest way to reduce operating expense. However, I think what we're going to see is the companies that took a little bit more care with that and found other opportunities than just simply headcount reduction are going to have much better trust in the market, be able to retain and attract new talent better than those that just went full mode on the headcount reduction
Mhm.
measure.
And
Um,
and the impacts we're talking about here, do you believe they are to some degree permanent, is this just a temporary situation that we need to work our way out of?
I think it's very much temporary. I think
Mhm.
resulted in a lot of activity, and companies are making the correct moves to try and automate more of their process and more of their distribution. But it is very much temporary. I believe it's being driven by the federal assistance program, and we'll see a return to work quite soon.
Yeah, some excellent insights, Kent Mahoney of Proxima. Thank you very much for sharing them with us, helping us to understand what businesses are undergoing right now in terms of rising costs and how they can cope with them. Thank you very much for being with me today. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, Bob. Appreciate it.